Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this last day of Cybersecurity Awareness Month. My name is Pedro Vidal. I'm the Global Consulting Sales Leader here at Cylance, and that includes our program around clinical security services as well as other security consulting. With me, I have Mike Bruchanski. Mike.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Bruchanski. I'm Senior Director of Product Management for Cylance. I run our product management team at Cylance, responsible for all of Cylance's products.
Awesome. The other piece of my experience is I spent 14 years at McAfee, and last 4 of the years there, I was leader of the U.S. healthcare team. So very familiar with the challenges in healthcare delivery, very familiar with the ecosystem upstream, downstream with device vendors. So definitely get the space. And again, thank you for joining. And quick walk through the agenda. So we're going to kind of frame up the conversation around, what are the threats around this announcement for medical device manufacturers as well as healthcare delivery organizations. What does it mean and what products are reaching the end of support by Microsoft? And then what it means for the manufacturers, more importantly, delivery organizations. And then finally, what's the organization's readiness? Are we going to close the gaps? And we have some recommendations there that we're going to walk through. So a lot of this is not new to everyone on the phone, and this is really just to frame the conversation. So if you look at the current challenges in the industry, what happens when the devices do become unsupported? Well, first of all, you got to really think about who's responsible for that device, just from a patching perspective. And then is that device, housing patient data? Is it critical information that is sensitive? And then understanding the large exposure, just walking through a hospital, it's a pretty public space, and just spending time there, you can understand that all these devices are very accessible. So what is the exposure? And then typically clinical operations are very decentralized. So you have devices popping up on networks in hospitals that typically aren't managed by the central data center, and it just causes more challenge for the healthcare industry overall. Now we look at what Microsoft announced. Basically, they announced that the support for Windows 7 is going to expire on January 14th, 2020. And you're no longer going to get updates. And you have to move. Ideally, they want you to move to Windows 10, which in a traditional environment isn't such a big deal. When you come to a clinical environment, it is a big deal. And we have to figure out, how do we get ahead of and mitigate threats that are going to expose, even if it's for a short window of time while you do migrate, or you work with your vendors to migrate from 7 to 10, how do you bridge the gap and make sure that there is no patient risk? That's what we're here to talk about today. If you look at the devices that could be affected, and I won't read every one of these bullets, but patient monitoring workstations, blood testing systems, I think what's important to understand is all these devices are provided service by a back-end data center usually, and they're on a network. And to understand that, what does the real risk footprint look like? What is the class of device that I should be worried about? That's the exposure, the large exposure piece that we're going to talk about today. It's also understanding that if they're asking for service, how do we prioritize what devices to worry about first? How prevalent is Windows 7 inside the clinical environment? All those things that are really questions that one needs to ask themselves. And if we learned anything from the past, the Wannacry outbreak across the pond, it wasn't even a really sophisticated piece of malware, but it did affect homogeneous, feature-rich kind of Windows environments. And usually it was the environments that weren't patched or on old OSs. And that's why it's super important to understand that this is by no means a FUD slide, but it is definitely something to think about, because a pretty clumsy Wannacry did a lot of damage. And if there is something more sophisticated and actually runs like it's supposed to, that really does cause for concern. So if you look at some of the causes there, it were just simple, security patches, or just using old Windows systems. And how do you mitigate that? That's definitely something that we want to talk about today. Walking through why you should be concerned. Again, healthcare delivery organizations really they have sensitive assets. The patient record is super valuable on the black market. Really, hospitals make easy targets just because there's multiple third parties. And if you look and walk around the OR or ER, or just go visit a relative in the hospital, you understand that there's a device in every room. There's wireless networks, and pretty accessible to a lot of people. So understanding that just easy targets, just in the fact that you don't have a fence around or a moat around your building, like, you know, a defense contractor would. You have the public coming in and visiting patients, and this is all just increases the attack surface. And if you look at what makes that so vulnerable, is the inventory of devices is the biggest challenge that I've seen when talking to current customers and even prospects, where they just don't know when, on the front end, when working with the Philips or the GEs and the clinical staff are buying these devices, when they just pop up on the network, you don't know what it is, you don't know where it's at, and you don't know how many of them you have. So part of the challenge you're going to run into is just figuring out which of the devices have Windows 7 today, and do you have a full inventory? So you know, sensitive assets, you're an easy target just because of the public nature of the business, and then, you know, why you're so vulnerable just on managing the devices. So we've given you some recommendations on what you can do before January 14th. I think the first step is really understanding what your clinical security program is or isn't. Understand where you stand, where you are in the maturity cycle of. Usually the first step is let's inventory the devices. And I think that's super important. And I give you some, in that bullet number 3, I give you some examples of technologies out there that aren't Cylance or BlackBerry related, but they do a really good job of inventorying assets over the wire. And Nuvolo, Medigate, Armis, there's tons of others. Those are just some of the top ones that I've heard customers actually looking at for inventorying. I think it's also important to understand, once you do the inventorying, you know, who are the key vendors in the device space? You know, is it Philips, is it GE, is it Siemens? And of those devices, we're going to go into bullet number 4, what are the most critical? This is all part of a proper security program, a clinical security program, because if you have certain class of device, let's call it a class A device, that has patient information that's very critical, it's life support, life-giving, understanding and how do you classify those, and then within that class, that's class A, very important device, how many of those class A devices have Windows 7? And then figuring out the methodology and the strategy to go and patch those devices is pretty key. Just understanding where you are is super helpful. And there's organizations like us that can help you along that path, outlaying the clinical program, figuring out how you actually classify the devices, and then what known vulnerabilities are on those devices. Some of the best practices, if you click lower, it would be around the device that you can't do anything with. Maybe you want to do a network segmentation. If you can touch the device, you want to harden the device for sure. And then you want to do some monitoring and logging to make sure that that the devices are behaving the way they're supposed to behave. So if a OR pump is actually doing what it's supposed to do, that's what you want. When anomalous behavior starts to happen, where they're doing things like pinging another IP or it's trying to get out to the internet when it shouldn't be, that's the stuff that you really want to get a hold of. So how can we help? So we have 2 sides of the house that can help you. And I'm going to, in a second, I'm going to toss it over to Mike Bruchanski to talk about the product and how we can help and why we can help, because we're so lightweight. But the consulting services I just talked about, where we actually go in and we can actually do a gap assessment against your clinical security program. And if you're saying to yourself, I don't have a clinical security program, that's also a good thing, because we can then give you a baseline of where you are today, where you need to be, the next specific steps. And some of the steps are going to be internal. We can give you recommendations on tooling, like I just talked about with Nuvolo and et cetera. And then we can go from there. We've also done this. We have many healthcare clients that are willing to be references for this kind of work. Even the large organizations are just taking steps now to form clinical security departments and functions, either under the CISO or under the CMIO. And the other side of the house is our Cylance Protect, which we'll get into in a second. So we take the approach of, we believe prevention is possible. If I turn that into a healthcare analogy, what I'd say is, it's a lot easier to prevent a heart attack than it is to clean up after one, just because you'll never be the same. So for us, we think preventative is always the best way to start. That's the approach we take. Now, the reason prevention has been so hard is because the level of compute required to prevent things from happening, to know every possible thing that could go wrong. And this is the stance that we take. And this is where I'll toss it over to Mike. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Pedro. So when we talk about prevention, with our product Protect, Cylance Protect, we have the ability to predict and prevent ransomware events or other types of malware events before they happen. And so what we're showing on this graph here is the time in months that Cylance was able to detect something before it came onto the scene. So what does that mean practically to us? So if we look on the graph, we can see Wannacry. Wannacry was a ransomware attack that was particularly prolific, especially in the healthcare vertical. And what that's saying is that Cylance would have been able to prevent that 20 months before it arrived on the scene. That means if you had Cylance Protect on one of your devices in your hospital and you put it in the basement and you never touched it again for 20 months, it would still have prevented you from this attack. Now, if we think about that in terms of security products that we're usually familiar with, especially anti-malware products, that seems kind of unheard of. If you think about the typical type of antivirus or anti-malware, there's a constant stream of updating, and you need to update it on a daily or sometimes multiple times daily basis for it to be remotely effective. And if you can consider a solution that you wouldn't have to update for many months or even years and still be effective, that's particularly interesting to devices in hospitals that maybe exist and can't be touched or updated for a long period of time. Now, the question is really, how do we do that? And our answer is, well, we use AI. Now, AI is kind of an interesting term. It's certainly a buzzword these days. And if you think about AI, in your mind, you may think of kind of a spectrum. One kind of AI that a lot of people are familiar with is Siri or something on your phone. You ask it a question, and about half the time it gives you the right answer. On the other end of the spectrum, you know, you have the Terminator from the future that's going to come and hunt people down and is all-knowing. And the answer is kind of neither of those. We're going to talk a little bit about what AI means to us and how we apply it. And for this, I'm going to use an analogy. This is a dog. You know it's a dog. You didn't have to reference, you don't have to be intimately familiar with this particular dog or seen this picture of a dog before or reference a book of dogs to say, oh yeah, this is indeed a dog, right? Unfortunately, that's how a lot of security products work. You have to have seen this before. You have to know about it. But you as a human recognize this instantly. The question is how? Because really what AI is doing is teaching a computer to do some things that humans can do. So if I were to ask you to describe what's a dog, you might say, well, a dog has floppy ears and it has 4 legs and it has fur and it has a tongue. Well, that's right. And what you're describing in that case is a feature. And so we can look at a dog and we can extract particular features of it that defines its dogness, right? Now, the question becomes, okay, that's great, but in my description of a dog with 4 legs and ears and fur, well, that also kind of sounds a lot like a cat, right? So if we really want to make a determination between what's a dog versus what is a cat, we have to not only look at the features, but then quantify those features. And a good example is an eye. If you think about, or you look at this picture here, you think about a cat's eye versus a dog's eye. They both have 2 eyes typically, but the eyes look different. And if we can measure and quantify those features in a way that describes them in a unique way, then we can add those to what we call a feature vector, a matrix. So from a computer perspective, computers aren't really good at identifying cats and dogs, but they're really good at establishing patterns and doing math. So if we can help a computer to define what are the features that you need to look for and how can you quantify those, then we're well on our way to determining what's a dog versus what's a cat. Now, the next step, once we've established features and we're able to quantify them, then we look at what we call classifying and clustering. So we would take, in our dog and cat algorithm, we would have it look at many, many, many pictures of cats and dogs. And if we have established our features correctly and defined the way we can quantify those features and created an algorithm that can classify and cluster them, we'll start to see certain patterns emerge. So in this case, what I have is a 3D representation of many pictures of cats and dogs. The colors represent different classifications. If we go through our AI and machine learning process correctly, we get to a point where things start to appear grouped. So we can see there's a series of red dots, and those are all clustered together, and those represent Persian cats. There's a series of green dots. Those represent wiener dogs. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because I'm not interested in learning about pictures of cats and dogs that I've already seen. I want to know when Pedro takes a picture of his dog that's never before seen on this planet, I want to be able to run it through my algorithm, and if I've defined it correctly, it will show up in one of those areas. When I run it through my algorithm, it shows up as a dot that's close to the green dots. It means Pedro has a wiener dog, right? That is essentially how our AI works. Now, we're not looking for cats and dogs. We're looking for malware. And so what we do is we apply the same concept between good files and bad files. Essentially, we take all the good files that we can get our hands on and all the bad files that we can get our hands on. Billions and billions of files. We create an algorithm, we run it through this algorithm, and the end result is an AI algorithm that provides us certain advantages. Now, these advantages, we don't do this for no particular reason. We do this for a very specific case. And we have at Cylance built our products on these AI algorithms, and we built a platform out of it. We have capabilities that can defend your computer or your hospital equipment against malware, malicious scripts, memory attacks. We can prevent against devices that are being attached that you don't want to. And then we can use that to assess and respond to different events, right? Now, the reason, again, that we do this is very specific. It provides us very interesting benefits. One, it's highly effective. In this case, like we talked about in the slide earlier, we can prevent things essentially before they come onto the scene. And the reason for that is essentially bad programs operate fundamentally in the same way. If you're not looking for a very specific bad program, I'm not looking for a very specific bank robber or a very specific bad person or a very specific dog. I'm just looking for something that's fundamentally bad. That makes us highly effective. And why that's important, particularly to this use case, is because as Microsoft begins to end of life their operating systems, you're probably not very concerned about the functional aspect of that operating system. Windows 7 has been around for a long time. I can almost guarantee that tonight, if you go to bed and turn it on tomorrow, it's going to operate in the exact same way. So from a functionality perspective, the capabilities of the operating system have been battle hardened, and they're going to continue to work for a long period of time. The real question, what you lose, is that security. You no longer have security updates. You no longer have changes to that operating system. And because of that, you need an application that's going to be extremely effective in preventing not only threats that are known today, but previously unknown threats that are going to come onto the scene, right? The other thing is it's very simple. What happens is when we do this, this AI creation, we create what we refer to as an AI model. Those models tend to have a long life. The model that's currently in our product has existed for around 2 years. And what that means is you no longer have to update those systems. Again, if we think back to how a traditional antivirus works, there's a constant stream of downloading new updates, scanning your machine, next day, download the updates, scan the machines. Now, especially in a hospital environment where we have a lot of different devices connected and various degrees of connectivity, there's a high level of effort that goes into just maintaining those updates. If you just no longer had to do that anymore, it makes your life a lot easier and you can focus on other security tasks, right? The other thing is performance. Although if you think about it in my mind before I explain things to you, if you said, hey, I'm going to use some AI-based solution, it might conjure up kind of ideas of, wow, this is going to take a lot of horsepower to run. I need a really powerful computer. But the answer is kind of the opposite. Because the type of machine learning, the type of AI and machine learning techniques that we're using is something that's called a supervised learning model. That means when it comes out of the Cylance model factory and it's put on your machine, it already knows all the things it needs to know. It doesn't need to learn and calculate, which is the performance-intensive part of using artificial intelligence. Instead, you get the benefit of the fact that you don't have to constantly scan your machine. So if we think about an extreme case, let's say I was going under the knife for some type of heart surgery and I had a computer that was critical in that operation, you wouldn't want that computer to say, okay, hold up, I know we're going to go under the knife here, but I need to scan your disk because I just got a new file update. That doesn't exist with Cylance. The way we minimize this performance is because we don't have to perform those scans. we look at files pre-execution. We're not constantly updating and scanning your machine. That means that we have a lower impact to the machine, that increases the longevity of the machine itself, and also reduces the intrusiveness in day-to-day operations. These things that we've found that are very attractive to our healthcare customers and also to medical device manufacturers themselves. The other thing that's unique about Cylance is that we can deliver it in many different ways. Essentially, Cylance solution consists of two parts from a technology perspective. There is the agent that runs locally on the machine, and there's the management console that typically runs in the Cylance cloud. So you would access that remotely, you'd send commands to your agent. Now, in a hospital environment, we know from our experience that there's various degrees of connectivity. You might have some amount of computers or medical devices that do have a direct connection to the outside internet, and so a cloud solution would be okay. The other thing is you might have a restricted pipe. Essentially, some amount of devices can connect to the internet, but only through a very specific path. We have a solution for that was actually built for one of our medical device partners, Becton Dickinson, and we've since kind of rolled it out to the wider audience of Cylance customers that we refer to as our Cylance Hybrid. This essentially serves as a proxy and an edge cache to help manage the connection between the Cylance agents and the Cylance cloud. Right? Now, the other end is one of the great parts about Cylance is all the intelligence, all that AI that I talked about is encapsulated locally on the agent, meaning that the agent doesn't really need to connect to the cloud at all. So let's say you had some type of medical device. Maybe it's a pill picker that lives in the basement that has no connectivity. You can still provide security to that device without any type of connectivity, and it'll function in the same way as it would to the cloud. We also have the ability to manage locally within on-premise networks through something we call Cylance On-Prem. So, in summation, what's the value that Cylance is bringing specifically on the product side? We can provide a solution that is highly effective for long periods of time without updating. We can minimize the performance impact on your machines, and we can also provide solutions that can utilize various degrees of connectivity to the outside internet without reducing the overall efficacy and functionality of the end product. Now, we've done that not only with partners and customers, we also do that with our services organization. And so we have a couple of case studies here that we'll talk about. One of the things I'm going to talk about first is Satellite Healthcare. Satellite Healthcare is a nonprofit organization, and they underwent a change in their security management. One of the things that they said they wanted to do is identify and remediate any pre-existing security breaches. Now, that's a good concept. As soon as there's a change in the guard, we want to understand, okay, where are we? What's out there? Is there anything that we need to do? So they contacted the Cylance services organization, and we went out and performed an assessment of various degrees. The way that works is we employ different scripts that utilize mostly existing capabilities as part of the operating system. We gather up that information and we provide an assessment. We do that as unintrusively and as quickly as possible, and then provide security recommendations. And we were able to do that over the period of a couple months and provide a baseline profile and recommendations to Satellite Healthcare and what their current situation is and what things look like for the future, recommendations about how they should manage their patches, how they should organize their network, and give them a guideline to move forward. At the end, the customer and the new executives were very happy with not only the information that was provided, but the speed and the fact that it was relatively unintrusive into their day-to-day operations, because it's not like at this point you can say, hey, I'm sorry, we have to cease being a hospital for a little bit so we can perform an assessment. That's just not practical. Pedro, I think you're familiar with the Phoenix Children's case study.
Yeah, thank you. So I've known Phoenix Children's for quite a while, maybe 10 plus years, and We helped, here at Cylance, we helped them out a couple of different ways. So we performed some penetration testing, some traditional security consulting for Phoenix Children's. And then the biggest thing that they're grappling with was they were still missing pieces of malware, and they had a heavy agent that was a traditional kind of legacy vendor, and they wanted to see how they could, do something different. So Mike explained how, how we do things differently, how we have a lightweight footprint on the CPU. So during the process of evaluating technologies, they looked at us for their traditional IT environment. And what they found was it was so significant, the difference between the footprint that the legacy vendor had and what we had. They were actually able to extend the life of their PCs by a year, which was pretty significant for a team. Phoenix Children's and their mission, and it's really based around child health care, and that's their mission. That's what they do first. They're not a security company. They do that first. And what they wanted to do was to save money on the PC fleet, but also have great protection. So they achieved that with us. And then the CISO started to think about what about our shared workstations? What about our devices that are Windows based? Since the footprint is so small, I think I have a way forward to protect those devices. So he actually went and deployed on specific clinical devices that were Windows based and the shared workstations, and he said he achieved the same kind of performance. So they have been a very happy customer of ours because of the two things that we allow them to do. We allow them to focus on their mission, and then we allow them to run operationally efficient, which saves them money, and again, just gives back to the mission of taking care of children. So it's a great success story, and we definitely have some actual documents you can review, and I think we're going to share that on the next slide. Yeah, so here's a slide of additional resources. We have fact sheet on what we can help you with on consulting services, as well as various white papers, and then of course the 2 case studies that we just reviewed. And then finally, if you want to learn more about what we talked about or have a deeper dive session with anything that we talked about, product, services, clinical strategy, advice, third-party tools, please contact us. Here's an email address and phone number. I'll open it up for questions for Q&A.
Yeah, Pedro, we have a couple questions here. One of the questions is, what operating systems does Cylance support? And that's a good question. So Cylance supports Windows, Mac, and Linux. Interestingly, we're talking about Windows 7 here. Cylance will support operating systems from Windows XP even and above. And that includes Windows Server operating systems and also the typical endpoint. On the Mac side, we support Mac operating systems. And then on Linux, we support many different distros, including the common distributions of Linux. One of the things we've done is working with our medical device partners. We often have custom distros or custom flavors of Linux that we are able to support with some interaction with Cylance engineering. That information is located in the Cylance website if you wanted to see very specifically what operating systems we support. Another question we have is, does Cylance have a specific consulting practice that's targeted towards the medical device industry? I know, Pedro, that's probably a good question for you to answer.
Yeah, yes, we do actually. And joining us as a part of the panelists to answer some questions, Rob Portvliet and his team actually handle the device testing itself. Rob, maybe you want to talk about our service there.
Sure. Thanks, Pedro. Hi, everybody. Rob Portvliet. I am the director of our IoT and embedded security practice, professional services. What we do is deep dive pen testing and reverse engineering of medical devices for both providers and for manufacturers. We assess the security of medical devices from both basically from the hardware, firmware, network attack surface, local perspective, network protocols, and their supporting systems. Typically, what we look at is the devices not in a vacuum, but as a whole of a system. So for instance, right, we would look at patient monitors from the perspective of both the bedside patient monitor, the central monitoring nursing workstation, the protocols it uses to communicate, and additional components of that system, such as wireless patient telemetry monitors. We look at the entire system as well as any back-end systems that it interacts with, right? And we look at how that also, the security of that environment impacts your network as a whole. One example there we've seen in the past is the way that some systems store credentials. They'll store, 80 Active Directory credentials in a poorly encrypted format rather than a secure format integrated with the operating system, which then, if retrieved from the device, allows you to then compromise further systems up to and including full Active Directory domain admin level compromise. That's some of what we do from a provider and manufacturer perspective. One other thing that we do many things, but just one other thing in particular that we do for manufacturers is what we call secure design consulting. And that's where we partner with our manufacturing clients to come in at the design phase, pre-prototype, to help manufacturers build a secure product. And then we can come back and pen test hands-on that prototype later to ensure that remediation or the design guidance has been effectively implemented.
We have another question that says, you loaded Cylance Agent on medical devices. Are you suggesting clinical workstations as a workstations on wheels? Now, Pedro answered clinical workstations to the, I guess this is internally. The other thing I would say is Cylance does work with large medical device manufacturers to have the devices shipped with Cylance on them out of the factory. So we work with one of the publicly announced companies that I talk about is Becton Dickinson. They're a large medical device manufacturer. Cylance is pre-installed on many of the devices that come from them. And the reason is the same reasons that we discussed as part of this webinar. It provides them with security for devices that have various levels of connectivity. It also provides them with longevity as far as the ability to update or the need to update them. So we have many other medical device manufacturers that we're working with. To my knowledge, BD is the one that we can most publicly talk about, but maybe in future webinars, we can go into a deeper dive about how we can support security on medical devices, not only beyond from the initial concept like Rob was talking about, but then through the life cycle of that device. Another question is, sorry, Pedro, do you want to jump in there?
I was just going to put there's another question about 510K certified devices. I was just going to put that together with this one. So anything that's already deployed, it's definitely how your organization reads the FDA guidelines. In that case, if you can't touch the device, we'd recommend some segmentation, some different approaches to protecting the device.
I will answer one more question here, a high-level question. Is there a different process for performing IRs on IoTs?
Yeah, so the IR incident response for the OT environments are a little bit different. So we have a full incident response capability here at Cylance. We do divide it into two groups, traditional incident response, and then we have a critical infrastructure team that handles the OT incidents. So it's a bit different. We definitely can take this offline and have further discussion on the differences and give you kind of the comparison.
Okay, I know we said that that was the last question, but I like this question, so we're going to answer it too. Does Cylance provide support back to BD? It assumes there's a support link between customer site and BD. And the answer is, yeah, kind of. We at Cylance, one of the things I'm responsible here for at Cylance is connection with our medical device OEM partners. So we work directly with the BD product security group as they roll out devices to certify Cylance on the different devices, on the various devices, and roll them out. So in a sense, yes, we provide support directly to BD. Now, BD also in certain situations has a link between a customer site where they will manage and try to ensure security, although that's not 100% of the case, right? One of the things we talked about is the various degrees of connectivity. In the event that you have a device that's connected, BD does have a system where they'll manage the security of that device, but then they also service non-connected devices. So again, something that in the basement of the hospital, it's never connected to the internet. BD service that directly, and they typically use field tech. And that's what we see commonly from our other medical device manufacturer partners as well. With that, I think we've covered most of the questions and our time is reaching the end. I think we'll leave it at that. And thank you everyone for joining, and look forward to talking to you more about how Cylance can help secure your medical devices and the healthcare industry in general.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.